I'm an active duty member of the US Air Force, and I will no longer be complicit in genocide. I'm about to engage in an extreme act of protest, but compared to what people in Palestine have been experiencing at the hands of their colonizers, it's not extreme at all. This is what our ruling class has decided will be normal: free Palestine. And those are the words of 25-year-old Aaron Bushnell, a US airman who self-immolated in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. in protest against the conflict in Gaza. Similar incident occurred in December at the Israeli embassy in Georgia. Joining me now to discuss this is former US diplomat and associate editor at the Daily Maverick, Spector. Brooks, appreciate your time this evening. Now, what might have driven Aaron Bushnell, a US Air Force member, to commit such an extreme act of protest?
Well, good morning. Good to be with you. I mean, at the heart of it, quite clearly, was his own personal feelings about circumstances in Gaza, Israel, and obviously his sense that he was in some way, shape, or form complicit in the affairs. Now let's back up just a little bit. He was a young man who came from a very small, carefully sequestered Christian community on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. He joined the Air Force as a volunteer, as everyone does these days. There's no draft, and he was assigned to a unit that dealt with cybersecurity rather than Air Force jets or fighter planes or anything of that sort. But nevertheless, his own personal values, beliefs, and feelings became preeminent or paramount in his own way of calculating all of this. This kind of event, obviously, because I'm old enough to remember, it takes me back to the Vietnam War, when a Buddhist monk in Vietnam began the trend of self-immolation in protest to the way in which the old South Vietnamese government and military was behaving or misbehaving, and as a result, that began to provoke that the run of these kinds of incidents provoked changes in American military engagement in Vietnam. Unfortunately, you could argue that the changes that occurred ended up being a larger American engagement in Vietnam rather than a smaller one, because at the time it was really a very small participation in what was still primarily something of a civil war. In this case, Aaron Bushnell, seems to be party, although an extreme version of it, to dissatisfaction among some in the government or the military. There was a petition signed a few weeks ago by several hundred, I think it was, employees at the U.S. Agency for International Development, occasioned to some degree by the fact that the director of the agency had been an internationally recognized expert on genocidal wars, and her participation as effectively a member of the cabinet, provoked a degree of outrage among employees, but not necessarily the majority. Now, there's no indication that I'm aware of that American military personnel, on the whole, have engaged in acts of disobedience against orders, if for no other reason that they are not directly involved in the fighting. And that I think is a crucial difference. Mr. Bushnell had the kind of emotional makeup and sense of things that led him to this. It's a terrible thing. I mean, you can't imagine seeing such a thing, but it represents a cry of despair, no doubt.
Now, one would suggest that that cry of despair is on behalf of the Palestine people. Many of us are obviously not privy to what's going on in Gaza, but is this sentiment a reflection of the sentiments and frustrations within certain segments of the U.S. population regarding the Israel-Palestine conflict?
Well, as I said, within the government itself, there are some murmurings of dissatisfaction, but it is not overwhelming. Among elected officials in Congress, support for the Israelis remains strong, with President Biden support perhaps a little too overenthusiastically right at the beginning, but understandably in the immediate aftermath of the attacks of October 7th, he effectively said, "We have your back, and we are supporting you all the way." As a result of the way in which the Israelis have carried out their response, this has begun to provoke a certain degree of dissatisfaction with that Biden policy. Most notably, if you were noticing this, in the primary election in the state of Michigan, which was just a few days ago, something on the order of 100,000 and 103,000 votes were cast as uncommitted, although in the end, Joe Biden won 80-some% of the vote, so the lack of support is a debatable proposition. It is quite clear that there is a lot of unhappiness on the part of many parts of the Biden coalition about the manner in which the Israeli response is being carried out and America's participation in supplying that response. So this is not an issue which, at least not yet, is dividing the country in the way that the Vietnam War did, but it is certainly not bringing the country together in the way that World War II might have done.
So what implications does this incident have for U.S.-Israel relations and domestic security measures, if at all? How much do we read into it? And I think it's also important to note that Biden's stance has somewhat softened over the last few months, from we're 100% behind Israel to, you know what, can you slow down to some degree? You know, there is a certain amount of despondency in the way Israel continues to bombard Gaza, particularly in light of the many innocent lives that are being lost.
Well, the specifics of Mr. Bushnell's demise are not going to affect policy in itself. I mean, let's be clear about that. One person's death, no matter how terrible, is not going to cause an abrupt change in policy. But as you note correctly, the Biden administration has begun, I wouldn't use the word soften, I would use the word alter or change, or adjust or recalibrate. Among other things, a number of Israeli settlers on the West Bank were sanctioned for their participation in activities against Arab citizens in the West Bank. The pressure against Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, has ramped up. At the same time, there has increased efforts to achieve a ceasefire, a general ceasefire, and B, a grand realignment or change in the circumstances of the Middle East. And then third, the continuing, as your lead-in to our discussion noted, there have been, I think the current number is something like 52,000 meals, I wanted to say meals on wheels, but no, meals airdropped into various parts of Gaza. It's probably not enough, but it's an indication that there is going to be more to come. I think what you are seeing is that the Biden administration is noting that its unstinting embrace of Israel and specifically Benjamin Netanyahu's policies are not a way towards a better answer. And that as a result, there is the recalibration, the rejiggering, the re-railing of certain aspects of it. What you're not going to see is America saying, okay, Israel, you're on your own, because that would open up another firestorm of protest in another direction within the U.S. So the Biden administration is caught in a number of different kinds of pulls and tugs on its decisions and its policies.
So you speak of recalibration. You speak of recalibration, and the U.S. government has initiated airdrops of humanitarian assistance into Gaza at this juncture of the Israeli-Hamas conflict. Why? Why are they doing this on their own and not following what has been the standard process of getting it through the various corridors?
I'm not a military expert. I mean, my engagement with the military was a long time ago, and I was a private. So, as a military strategist, I'm probably not your man. But what I can say is that it's clearly much easier and more efficient to engage in the kind of airdropping of rations, of food supplies, medical supplies, whatever it might be, in this manner, especially because the territory that is being targeted with the food drops is so small, and because they are able to make use of cooperation from several neighboring nations. Jordan, the missions apparently were launched from Jordan, which is not all that far away. They overflew Israel, which obviously would have been granted. By contrast, the food and relief corridors have been subject to all manner of difficulties, ranging from a certain degree of obdurateness on the part of the Israelis and checking every single box, perhaps, and also because of the sheer logistical nightmare that is now taking place. So whether or not this is the right way to do it is a question people are going to debate, but it is clearly one that the Air Force is not only capable of, but well practiced at doing. They supply troops, they supply facilities, they supply other people through airdrops, all in all kinds of ways, and it goes back straight through to the early post-World War II era, when much of the city of Berlin, in fact, was supplied through an air corridor, not thrown out of the specially designed drops, but landed on an airfield that was in existence. I mean, I'm not sure that there are airfields in Gaza at this point that would be capable of receiving that kind of commercial traffic, but airdrops are an established way of doing it.
Are these airdrops not an indication of the dissatisfaction by the United States or the continued stifling of the process by Israel? I mean, certainly much of what we've read seems to suggest that, because the U.S., I stand to be correct, has not been directly involved in the distribution of aid. So the fact that the U.S. military itself has taken this upon themselves to do almost suggests in many ways that they're a little bit dissatisfied with that process of continued frustration by the Israeli authorities.
Well, I'm sure they're dissatisfied with the process generally, whether it's on the part of the Israelis or on the part of the inability of any local forces able to manage or monitor the arrival of trucks, or whether it's the people who manage the departure and dispatching of the trucks themselves. But I would correct you in this one regard, that the United States has been involved, as I understand it, because it is one of the leading financial supporters of this process, and has been for some years in the supplying of the delivery of supplies through UNRWA, the United Nations relief agency that operates in Gaza. But I think that if you had been a fly on the wall of the Situation Room in the White House when this came up, you'd probably hear something along the lines of one of the military folks saying, "Mr. President, we can do this. We can supply food and other necessities by air. Just let us do it, and we'll organize it, and we'll take care of it." Now, whether they can supply all of it, whole different question. But it's quite clearly something that it had been determined that they could do it, despite all of the other logistical distractions, difficulties, and barriers that existed and exist now, and probably will exist for some time to come. Remember, moving a couple of hundred trucks a day through a military and a customs checkpoint in the midst of warfare is not something that is easily accomplished, even if everybody is cooperating. It's still a major logistical nightmare. It is ultimately easier, although we have to guess at whether it's sufficient and successful, dropping supplies through the kinds of planes that are designed for precisely this kind of activity. So is it a final answer? No, of course not. Is it more than a Band-Aid? Yes. Is it restoration of health and quality of life? No, of course not.
Now, how might the U.S. airdrops influence the dynamics of the conflict and the prospects for peace negotiations between Israel and Hamas?
Well, now you're asking me to read the thinking of both Benjamin Netanyahu and Mr. Sinawar.
Well, you were a fly on the wall a few minutes ago, so I figured I might as well.
Yeah. That was a guess on my part, based on the way.
Feel free to hazard another guess.
All right. What it's going to do is possibly make both sides, Sinawar's folks down there in his tunnel and Netanyahu in his command center, they're both going to say, maybe, just maybe, this is a goad in the direction of the larger ceasefire that the U.S., Qatar, and Egypt have been pushing for the last number of days, just possibly. Or, and this is the less cheerful view, both of those two men and their aides and their friends and their advisors will say, fine, let the Americans do it. We'll continue what we're doing. That would be the less pleasant outcome, obviously.